On old publicity stills, these families looked untouchable. Perfect smiles, perfect homes, perfect Hollywood lives. But behind those polished images were leukemia wards, special schools, psychiatric institutions, hearing loss, autism diagnoses, cerebral palsy, and years of private caregiving the cameras never showed. In this video, we're looking at 8 famous parents whose children faced medical crises or lifelong disabilities that fame could not fix completely. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Sylvester Stallone and Sergio Stallone. Sylvester Stallone built his legend on raw force, Rocky, Rambo, a face that looked carved out of survival itself. On screen, he was the man who kept getting up. At home, the battle looked very different. His son Sergio, born in 1979 to Stallone and Sasha Jack, was diagnosed with autism around age 3. Stallone later described the shock of realizing that something in the household was changing, and that ordinary father-son expectations were not going to unfold in an ordinary way. Then everything changed. Instead of a loud Hollywood family life, the home became structured around therapy, observation, routines, and protecting a child who struggled to connect in conventional ways. Reports from the time said Sergio was largely kept out of the spotlight, and Stallone and Zach created a research fund connected to autism work in the mid-1980s. Stallone said Sasha handled much of the day-to-day in the trenches labor, while he used premieres and publicity to raise money. That detail matters because it shows how fame did not erase the work. It only changed the scale of the fundraising. But the harder part was emotional, because this was not a crisis that produced one dramatic ending. It became a long, private discipline, patience, repetition, adjustment, silence. For a man sold to the world as indestructible, the family story was far more tender than heroic. The public saw a fighter throwing punches and dominating the screen. Behind the image was a father learning that love sometimes means lowering the noise, protecting the routine, and accepting that progress may come in inches, not speeches. That is what makes this story so revealing. The macho icon was not really facing an opponent. He was learning how to build a gentler home. Red Skelton and Richard Skelton. Red Skelton made America laugh with rubber-faced innocence and beautifully timed sadness. He was one of the biggest family entertainers of his era, and his television persona felt almost childlike in its warmth. That is what makes the story of his son Richard so painful. At the height of Skelton's popularity, Richard was diagnosed with leukemia at age 9 and, according to biographical accounts, was given about a year to live. Here is the heartbreaking part. While CBS reportedly told Skelton to take whatever time he needed, he believed returning to television helped him keep life feeling joyful for his son. After the diagnosis, the family traveled so Richard could see more of the world. One of the most remembered moments from that period was an audience with Pope Pius X in July 1957, which Richard reportedly considered a high point of the trip. Imagine the contrast. America still saw the clown, the storyteller, the man who could turn embarrassment into laughter. Inside the house, the family calendar was being shaped by doctors, fear, and borrowed time. And yet Skelton kept performing, not because he was untouched, because he was devastated. Accounts say he found it difficult even to mention his children on air after Richard became ill, and only resumed doing so when his son encouraged him. Richard died in May 1958, shortly before his 10th birthday. That quiet detail is what lingers. One of the country's most beloved comedians could fill a studio with laughter, but he could not save the boy waiting for him at home. It is one of the clearest examples of public joy standing beside private grief. Neil Young and Ben Young. Neil Young's public image was restless and uncompromising, a songwriter who could sound tender one moment and defiant the next. But one of the deepest forces in his life was not fame, it was caregiving. Neil and Peggy Young's son Ben was born with cerebral palsy, and the difficulty of finding the right educational setting for him pushed the family toward a very different kind of legacy, The diagnosis reshaped the house. This was not just about medical appointments. It was about communication, mobility, schooling, and the long daily question of how a child with severe physical and speech disabilities could fully participate in the world. The Bridge School says it was founded in 1986 after Neil and Peggy were inspired by Ben and by the gap they saw in educational services for children with extensive communication and physical needs. That turns a private family struggle into something bigger than biography. It becomes infrastructure, it becomes access, but the emotional center stayed personal. Because institutions do not appear out of nowhere, they usually begin in a kitchen or a difficult meeting, or a parent realizing that available systems do not truly fit their child. Over time, the Bridge School and its famous benefit concerts became part of Neil Young's public legacy. Yet underneath that history was a father and mother trying to answer one intimate question. What does dignity look like for our son? That is why this chapter feels different. It is painful, yes, but it is also a story about caregiving turning into advocacy, and love becoming a place where other families could breathe a little easier. Burt Bacharach and Nikki Bacharach. Burt Bacharach was elegance in musical form, precise, polished, effortless on the surface. His daughter Nikki's life tells a much darker story. Nikki, the only child of Bacharach and Angie Dickinson, was born prematurely in 1966. Later accounts from her parents and news reports described years of emotional and developmental struggles, including sensory sensitivity and what was eventually identified as Asperger's syndrome, now understood within the autism spectrum. But nobody seemed to have the right language early enough. That matters. Because when a child is suffering and the adults around her do not fully understand why, the house can fill with confusion, blame, and wrong conclusions. Bacharach later said doctors did not identify autism-related issues when Nikki was young. Dickinson described how noise sensitivity especially tormented her daughter. Reports over the years also connected Nikki's difficulties to long psychiatric treatment and hospitalization. So this was not one diagnosis, one appointment, one fix. It was decades of strain, and the public barely saw it. The world saw awards, standards, celebrity marriages, and one of the most successful careers in popular music. Offstage, this family was living with chronic distress that fame could not soften. Nikki died by suicide in 2007 at age 40. Bacharach later spoke with visible regret about how little was understood when she was young. That is what makes this chapter so heavy. It is not only a story about loss, it is a story about delayed recognition, misread suffering, and a daughter who spent much of her life carrying pain that the culture around her was slow to name correctly. David Tomlinson and Willie Tomlinson. David Tomlinson is remembered by many viewers as the proper, tightly wound father in Mary Poppins. He could play flustered dignity better than almost anyone. But his family life carried a quieter, more demanding challenge. His son Willie was autistic at a time when even getting a diagnosis could be difficult, and later accounts say that experience became one of the central facts of Tomlinson's life away from the screen. The family kept moving through a world that understood very little. That changes everything inside a home. Ordinary routines become experiments. Schooling becomes uncertain. Social behavior gets judged harshly. Parents are forced to become interpreters, advocates, and sometimes shields. Obituaries and later profiles say Tomlinson used his public connections to raise money and awareness for autism in Britain, and that Willie was among the earlier children in the UK to receive such a diagnosis. That detail gives this chapter a softer tone, but not an easy one. Advocacy is often born from exhaustion, and that public image stayed deceptively neat. Audiences saw the polished actor with clipped delivery and old-school charm. They did not see the long, private work of trying to build support around a child whose needs were poorly understood by the era. That is why this story matters. It reminds us that not every family tragedy ends in a funeral. Some become lifelong systems of adaptation. Tomlinson reportedly helped push awareness forward because he had no choice but to learn. Beneath the tidy Disney image was a father discovering that love sometimes means creating the support structure that should have existed before your child ever needed it. Julie Newmar and John Jules Smith. Julie Newmar embodied a very specific kind of Hollywood glamour. She was statuesque, witty, and unforgettable, the kind of star people associated with beauty first and complexity later. But her life as a mother tells a far more private story. In a 2019 Los Angeles Times interview, Newmar said her son John was born when she was 48. Public accounts say John was born with Down syndrome, and that after contracting meningitis as a toddler, he lost his hearing and later his ability to speak. Then beauty had to become labor. Not cosmetic beauty, daily beauty. Patient beauty, the kind built out of routine, visual communication, protection, and years of caregiving that never becomes glamorous no matter who is doing it. Newmar has spoken of John in loving, almost reverent terms, describing how visually alert and deeply felt his world is. That matters, because this chapter should not be reduced to damage alone. It is also about adaptation, about a mother learning how to meet her son where he lived. Still, the contrast is impossible to ignore. The public remembered Catwoman, the camera angles, the poise, the effortless confidence. But at home there was hearing loss, developmental disability, and a caregiving future that did not end when the child phase ended. It stretched forward, quietly, for decades. That is what makes Newmar's story so moving. Her fame depended on being seen. Motherhood asked her to spend years seeing someone else with total patience. Behind the glamorous image was a woman doing intimate, demanding work that most audiences never imagined when they applauded her. Ed Asner and Charlie Asner. Ed Asner projected authority. Even warmth from him had weight. He could seem gruff, commanding, almost immovable. That is why his reflections on his son Charlie are so revealing. In later interviews, Asner said Charlie was diagnosed as autistic at 7 or 8, which he described as late. He also admitted that before understanding what was happening, behavior could be misread in ordinary parental terms. That kind of misunderstanding can reshape an entire household. What looks like defiance may not be defiance. What looks like rudeness may be overload, confusion, or a child failing to decode a situation the way others expect. Asner said Charlie taught him patience, and even that word feels bigger here than it sounds. Patience means slowing down your own impulses. It means changing the emotional weather in a room. It means rethinking discipline, explanation, school placement, and what progress actually looks like. And that learning did not stay private. Asner later became connected to broader autism advocacy, and his family eventually helped build the Ed Asner Family Center, which supports neurodivergent people and their families. So this chapter carries both humility and legacy. The old television giant was not simply a father preaching acceptance from a distance. He was a parent admitting he had needed to learn. That honesty gives the story its strength. The public saw a man who always seemed to know what was going on. At home, he had to accept uncertainty first, then slow down, then listen better. Sometimes that is the real beginning of love. Jacqueline, Susann, and Guy Mansfield. Jacqueline Susann sold glamour, scandal, and emotional excess to millions of readers. Her name came to symbolize ambition in high style, but the most painful chapter of her life was largely hidden from the public. Her only son, Guy Mansfield, was born in 1946 and, according to biographical accounts, was diagnosed with severe autism around age 3. Some reported accounts say he underwent shock treatments under a prominent child psychiatrist before later being placed in the Emma Pendleton Bradley home in Rhode Island. This is where the story becomes especially haunting, because it is not only about disability, it is also about era, mid-century stigma, family secrecy, institutional medicine at a time when autism was poorly understood and often handled in ways that now feel brutal. Accounts say Susann and Irving Mansfield told many people their son was away for severe asthma, hoping to shield him from stigma and perhaps still hoping he might improve enough to come home. Other accounts say they visited him faithfully. Both things can be true at once. Deep love, deep helplessness, and the public persona never showed the wound. What the public saw was a woman selling bold novels and living loudly. What remained hidden was the possibility that much of that drive was tied to fear about Guy's future care and financial security. That is why this chapter lands so hard. It is the hidden child story at its bleakest. Not because the parents did not care, but because the period offered so few humane options. Behind one of publishing's flashiest success stories was a mother living with institutional silence, private guilt, and a grief that did not have good language in her time. These stories remind us that fame can buy privacy, treatment, and influence, but never certainty. Which family story affected you most, and why? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell for more untold stories.